Welcome to the DST podcast season 2, where we discuss issues that are relevant in our Indian context from both a theological and practical perspective.
Well, welcome to the DST podcast, and we are very, very privileged to have a special guest with us today, and that is Dr. Darrell Bock. He is one of the preeminent New Testament scholars in the world today. He's the author of over 40 books, including major commentaries on Luke and Acts. He's also been a professor at Dallas Theological Seminary for over 43 years now, which is amazing. He's also the executive director for cultural engagement at the Hendricks Center for Christian Leadership at Dallas Seminary. He's married to Sally. He's got 3 adult children, 5 grandchildren, and he's been in Delhi this week. It's been a real joy and privilege to have you in Delhi, Dr. Bock, and thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and I've had a great time. Love the students. It's been a good week.
Great. So we're going to get to Acts a little bit and cultural engagement a little bit and a few other topics like that. But I thought for this podcast, we'd start at the beginning. We'll begin at the beginning and get to a little bit more about you. And so, if you could just tell us
a little bit about God created the heavens and the earth. And
maybe not that early.
After a few years went by, my parents introduced me into the world.
Yeah.
And I was born in Calgary, Canada, actually.
Yeah, I was delighted to hear that.
Yeah. So, but left Calgary when I was 2.5. So I don't have any memories of living in Canada other than the trips I take back there. Didn't grow up in a Christian home. We attended, I would say, a theologically moderate church when I was growing up, but my parents left Judaism right before I was born. They were both Jewish. And I actually didn't know I was Jewish until I was 13. One day, my dad's brother showed up with his 3 sons, and we were around the dinner table, and they're talking about going to synagogue. And I knew a synagogue wasn't a church. I still can't remember this day whether I asked my brother for the information or my dad, what's going on? And then I was told the story about right before I was born, my parents informed their parents that they weren't going to be going to synagogue anymore. And they got isolated by the family. And so we ended up in a moderate church. But my mom got cancer in her mid-30s. And so she had 6 operations in the space of 8 years and slowly declined. She passed away when she was just 42 years old. And that basically stopped our church attendance because she was literally in and out of the hospital much of that time. And so I had a little bit of exposure to Christianity growing up, but not significantly. So I thought I would have classified myself when I was a teenager as an agnostic. Didn't deny God, but didn't necessarily think he existed. One of my closest friends in the world came to the Lord in between his 8th grade and 9th grade year. I was a year ahead of him in school, and came home from camp and shared Jesus with me for the first time. So I was a 9th grader, and he had a 3-point message. You need Jesus. You need Jesus. You need Jesus. That was his 3 points. I thought he had absolutely lost his mind. And over the space of 5 years, several people shared with me in one form or another, friends in high school, this friend, other friends. And then, so I went into my college years with people sharing with me and thinking about the faith, but not really being a believer. And I had questions about Christianity that I would ask them that kind of would put them in neutral. So I just kept asking them. But I prayed this prayer the night before I went to college because I had what we call a potluck roommate. That means the school picks your roommate because you didn't, decide to live with someone. And so it's a little bit like getting engaged, okay? You in India understand how this kind of a marriage can work. And so I prayed the night before I left, Dear God, I don't know if you exist, but if you do, please don't give me a Bible-carrying Christian because I want to enjoy my college years. Amen. That was the prayer. Nothing right about it. And I get to my room, and my roommate had arrived, but he wasn't in the room, and his trunk was sitting in the middle of the room. The way the room was configured, there were 2 beds, and then the space in the middle, and there were 2 desks behind the beds where he studied. And I walk in, his trunk's in the middle of the room, and on top of the trunk is a Bible. And so I knew God had answered the prayer, and he had answered it no. And my roommate and I became very, very good friends, and his life, along with the life of others who were sharing with me, really made a difference in opening me up to think about Christianity. And then between my freshman and sophomore year in college, I came to the Lord. And because it was a 5-year process, basically, by the time I came to faith, I just dove in full. And so there was no hesitancy, no adjustment. I knew I had made a life decision. And so we started a Bible study in my sophomore year in college, between my freshman and sophomore year in college. We started a Bible study, and my roommate for that year and I, both Christians, decided to hold a Bible study for our friends. And it started off with 6 people my sophomore year. By my senior year, I was leading the study, and we had a big 4-bedroom apartment, and we had people in every room coming. There were people who couldn't see the teacher. And so it became a big deal on campus. And I took an adult Sunday school my senior year in college, and it went from 12 to 120 in that year. And we actually had to move to a mall because the church didn't have a space big enough to hold the class. Wow. So that was kind of an indication I should go to seminary, which is what I did. And I went from Dallas and majored in Old Testament to Aberdeen in Scotland to major in New Testament. Seminary asked me to come back to teach as soon as I graduated. So at 28 years old, I ended up at the seminary. I've been to the seminary ever since. And so I'm in my 43rd year of teaching this next year, and we're still blowing and going. So that's the story.
Wow, that is quite a remarkable story, and I'm glad we started at the beginning.
Yeah, exactly.
And actually, there's a lot more that I would love to probe in that. But so what kind of pushed you over the edge after that 5-year sort of
Well, I think
that
I tell people that engagement with someone who's not a believer is as much about how you're relating to them as it is the content of the faith. Because I say this all the time, when you're engaged in evangelism with people who don't have a theological background, you're having to create categories of their way of thinking that they currently don't have. And they have to be open to that. And so that openness comes when they develop a relationship with you, when they see you living in a different way, stirs their curiosity. In fact, if you listen to the testimony of most people who come to faith who did not grow up in a Christian home, somewhere in the testimony will be this section. It will go, I met this person, or I went into this group, and they'll name them. And they'll say, and their life was different. There was something interesting about it, and it made me curious. And from that point, the bridge has been built into people considering their faith.
So where did you go to college, and what did you study?
I was I started off at Southern Methodist University in Dallas for 1 year, and then my wife-to-be went to Texas. So rather than go back and forth every weekend, I decided I would go to college where she was going to college, which was a great decision because I ended up marrying her, and I've been paying for it ever since. And so I studied European history at the University of Texas in Austin, and then moved on into Old Testament at Dallas and New Testament in Aberdeen.
Okay, interesting. And tell us a little bit about your seminary experience at Dallas, and how did that end up leading you to PhD studies?
Well, we have a 4-year program at Dallas. We don't have a 3-year MDiv. It's a THM. And I majored in Old Testament because I knew eventually I wanted to get to the New Testament and to Jesus, but I thought I better understand the Old Testament well as a backdrop to understanding what's going on in the New Testament. So I majored in Old Testament at Dallas, and really ended up focusing my last 2 years on Christology and the roots in the Old Testament. And then that's what I ended up writing on my dissertation at Aberdeen. My Aberdeen dissertation was Luke and Old Testament Christology. So how Luke developed his Christology out of the use of the Hebrew Scripture, and that put me in the Gospels. That put me into what at the time was a key part of New Testament studies: redaction criticism. How do the Gospels edit each other, and how does that work, and what does that do to the message? Those kinds of technical things, and then I was asked to write the Luke commentary almost immediately after graduating from Aberdeen. My dissertation was published immediately, and I got asked to write a commentary on Luke, and that process took about 14 years from start to finish.
Wow.
So,
okay. So, well, let's get into that a little bit more. But before that, you mentioned about meeting your wife, and she was going to a different college. So just tell us really briefly about.
Okay, so this is somewhat of
story.
a funny story. I dated another girl all the way through my senior year in high school, but there was a pack of girls that were a part of that friendship. And I had made the mental note that if I ever broke up with the girl I was dating, Sally would be the next girl I would ask out. So we did break up, and I followed the plan. And so asked her out, and really we dated ever since. I mean, we connected from the very beginning, and have been together. We'll be celebrating our 49th wedding anniversary this December and 50th next year. And we're taking our kids and grandkids on a big cruise. We're probably going to take a week and take a cruise and just do a family celebration. So we're looking forward to that. We're in the process of planning that right now for them. They just get to go along for the ride. We're going to pay for it and just have a great family time.
Wow, 50 years of marriage next year, you said. Yeah. And you have 3 children, 5 grandchildren, so that's fantastic. So let's move on and talk a little bit about your work, especially your writing and teaching work. So, tell us, how did you get into teaching as a vocation, as opposed to pastoral ministry? Or
I pretty much knew early on that I was going to end up in teaching rather than pastoral ministry. When I was leading this Bible study in college and I was preparing for it, and I was reading the commentaries and doing my study work, I basically said to myself, I can do this. What I'm reading and sensing and what I'm seeing in the commentators is something that comes, for lack of a better description, fairly naturally to me. So I had a sense I might be academic. And then as I was moving through, I was grading for professors as I was going through. I was one of their graders, graded for one professor for 3 years straight. And I was just being reinforced that was the direction I should go. When I did get up and speak, I did my internship my first year in Greensboro, North Carolina, and one of our very established professors came and spoke at the church, and then I preached the next weekend, and they put it on the same cassette. So the professor was on one side and I was on the other. And the pastor who I did the internship under got a note from someone listening to the tape saying, who's the person on the other side of that tape? Because, the reason they were circulating is because he was a DTS pastor on the front side. Said, because he's as good as the person who's teaching at Dallas Seminary. And so, and he told me this, and he was reaffirming it. He was basically saying, you're really designed to be teaching and thinking about the relationship of the church rather than being in a pastorate. And so I got multiple reinforcement as I was moving through seminary that was the direction I should go, and I just pursued it.
Okay. Good, and we're glad that you did. So it sounds like Luke was there. Maybe you can just tell us, how did Luke come in? You said it came in your PhD studies. Mm-hmm. So even at that point, where did Luke?
So there are a couple of factors. One was, when you do your doctoral work, you don't go to a school. You really sit under a supervisor, because when you do your doctoral work, at least in the UK, you're only writing a dissertation. There's no classwork. So it's 3 years on one topic. It's like being pregnant 3 times in a row. So, that is your baby the whole time. So, and so I picked a supervisor who was one of the leading emerging evangelical scholars in New Testament in UK at the time, Howard Marshall. And his interest was Luke. But I also decided I wanted to do Luke because at one point when I was in seminary, I thought to myself, what books of the New Testament do I know the least about? And the answer was Luke and Acts. Really Acts more, but Luke and Acts together. And I'm sitting here realizing Luke is actually a lot of the New Testament. In fact, Luke wrote more of the New Testament than any other writer. Most people think it's Paul, but it's Luke. By a nose, but he did it. And And I also refer to Luke as the orphan gospel because every other gospel has had a prominent place in the history of interpretation, and Luke has never had that platform. Matthew and John were big at the very beginning because they were written by the apostles, and so they drew a lot of attention early in the church. Mark became central when scholars decided that Mark was likely the first gospel written. So since the 18th century, Mark has had a very prominent role. And Luke's been sitting there off by the side, the orphan gospel, but he has more breadth of Jesus' teaching than anyone else. 50% of the parables that come out of Jesus' life and ministry come to us from Luke alone. So he covers a wider array of topics than any other writers. And so it's pretty important to know what's going on in Luke. And so I decided that's what's going to major in. And then, of course, he has the sequel, okay? So no one else is doing that. So you put those two things together and you go, Luke's a pretty good person to be studying in the New Testament.
Right. And 14 years is a long time to write a commentary.
Yep. Every day.
Every day for 14 years.
For 14 years.
And was that the Baker
Yeah, it's the
commentary?
Baker 2-volume commentary series.
Okay. And I think in between, or maybe afterwards, you wrote
I wrote
other-
Acts. I wrote Acts slightly later. That only took 4 years because I had accumulated so much understanding of what Luke was doing that it moved more quickly.
And tell us why 14 years and how did that process kind of unfold?
So I did
over-
a verse a day. I get an hour to an hour and a half every day, and my goal was to write 1 page a day. I could do it in that time frame, do the research and write it up and get something down on paper. Fortunately, there were computers, so you could edit. So I didn't worry about putting it all together because I went through it 4 times by the time it was all done. And every time I was looking at it from a different angle and making different kinds of additions and that kind of thing. So I went through it 4 times, spent 1 sabbatical, 1 entire year just going through the entire thing in Germany. I did 4 single-year sabbaticals in Germany. And and that's just how long it took. My son was born right at my 3rd child. Son was born right as I was signing the contract to do the commentary. He was in junior high by the time I was done, and so I tease people that he grew up with a commentary at his side. So yeah. And literally every day. I mean, I take the odd day off, but it was mostly every day.
Huh. That's remarkable. And you had other projects going on?
I had
in
other
between?
projects going on. I was teaching full time, et cetera. But my point is that there are 2 kinds of writers. Some writers need blocks of time to do their research. And the trouble is, if you're teaching full time in a seminary, you never get those blocks of time. That's why people take sabbaticals and go away for a year and do it. But I thought, no, that's if I wait till I get blocks of time, I'll be 85 before I'm done. So I developed the discipline of doing it a little bit every day, and I can work that way. I can pick up where I leave off and that kind of thing, and it worked.
And is that a practice that you continue?
That's why I'm able to produce so many books, because the discipline of that has never gone away.
So it's not let you take like a morning or 3 hours or even a week or
No,
a month
it's all
or
in
something
little
like
chunks. A verse a day keeps the devil away.
Wow. Okay. That's very interesting. I don't know how other people do it, but I don't think most people do it that way.
No,
from
they
what
don't.
I've heard.
Yeah,
It's mostly bigger chunks of time and
That's right.
sabbaticals and so on.
There's another thing that makes me productive, and that is I don't think of myself as a perfectionist. So I don't feel compelled to try and write the last word, because it's kind of setting a goal that sets you up for failure. And your goal is to contribute to something that advances the conversation. So once I feel like I have said something that needs to be said that represents a contribution, I'm satisfied, because the amount of time it takes you to do that last 5% that gets you to perfection, or your perception of perfection, I can write another book. So,
Right. So, tell us a little bit about your journey. So we want to get into cultural engagement and a little bit about the book of Acts. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about your journey from Luke and historical Jesus and those kinds of things. And then seems like in the last few years, moving quite heavily into cultural engagement a little bit. That's again, not a unexpected journey, maybe. But
Yeah, I think it's because we have treated the academic space like a university discipline. That's not the church. The church is designed to have our theology be applied to life. And so for me, it's a natural progression. I was president of the Evangelical Theological Society. You get elected for 1 year, and you give a talk at the end. And when I was elected, I did a talk on purpose-driven theology, and I was making an appeal that we need a different kind of academic in the church, not people who think on the university model and just speak to the various intellectual challenges that exist, but people who are really public theologians, who really step in, serve the church, show the relevance of theology, et cetera. What I didn't realize at the time was actually writing my job description that I have now and what I've been doing for the last well over a decade. And it is a different kind of theological engagement, has different sets of concerns. It's one of the reasons I'm here in India, because I deeply believe that in order to do that well, you don't need to be confined to one cultural context. You have a sense of what God is doing around the world. So every summer I'm away for 2.5 to 3 months in different countries, taking a look at what's going on and trying to think through the practical application of how you contextualize that in the different settings that exist across the globe. So for me, it's a natural progression, but it is outside the normal mold of the way an academic thinks of themselves. And I actually think the church needs more of it, not less.
What year was it that you were the president of ETS?
2000.
Okay. So in many ways, this has been a shift since the 2000s.
Yeah.
So it's been almost 25 years now.
Yeah, exactly.
So Dr. Bock, moving from biblical studies or traditional New Testament studies more into cultural engagement, I assume that would have been some kind of a transition requiring maybe new skills or disciplines that you would have had to learn, or just tell us about how that transition was.
Well, my college work was in the humanities. I started off in radio, TV, and film thinking I was going to be a sports broadcaster, and then I came to the Lord and knew pretty quickly I was going to move into full-time Christian work of some kind. And so I shifted to history and the humanities, concentrating on European history, pre-Renaissance, through the Reformation, up to the Enlightenment, because I figured understanding that history and those dynamics were important. So I always had woven together an interest in history with an interest in culture and an interest in sociology. And thinking that I had totally left the media thing completely behind. And it basically took a 30-year hibernation. So I started to move in this direction, and as I was moving in the cultural engagement direction, and I ended up getting in cultural engagement because I was responding to stuff that was happening in the media with historical Jesus. And one of our national networks, American Broadcasting Company, I wrote them a letter about a special that they did. They responded actually quite professionally and said, "Can you help us? Can we talk about this?" And so I engaged in conversations with them, and I ended up speaking a lot on historical Jesus issues and actually doing some background consulting with some of these national networks. When they went to interview, they say, well, who should we interview that's theologically conservative? Because they tend to concentrate in the Northeast and on the Ivy League schools that weren't theologically conservative. And that put me into the media space. And all the stuff that I learned in media, I was responding to people, helping them, because I understood what their job was and what they were trying to do. I never had a chip on my shoulder about what they were about. And so, and then that eventually, when the iPod came out, when Steve Jobs announced the iPod, I used to listen to Apple thing every year to see what the innovations were going to be. The day it came out, I was on sabbatical in Germany. I sent an email to our administration saying, this is a great way to connect with alumni and keep them up to date with things, especially if they're on the field. We ought to think about doing a podcast. And so the president and I would do it when our schedules managed and when we thought the topic was significant enough to address, but there was no rhyme or reason to it. And then we went to the Lausanne 3 conference in Cape Town in 2010, met with our alumni, and when our president asked, how can we continue to serve you, to a person and with total enthusiasm, they said, keep those podcasts coming. We really appreciate the ministry that represents. I walked out of that room, said to him, we do this ad hoc. There's no rhyme or reason to it. We just do it as it comes up and as we think it's valuable. we could be much more intentional about how to do this. And then he said, so he was thinking about it, and then I said, and then you have an element on the campus that you're struggling to know what to do with. I think I know what to do with it. And so cultural engagement came alongside Christian leadership, and here's that transition. When the center was founded in the mid-'80s, the issue of Christian leadership was basically about how do you form an organization, make it run well, build good teams, what should the character of the leader be, et cetera. It was a very, very personalized study of leadership. And our culture was shifting. And the culture had shifted so much, the way I like to describe it is we went from being the home team to being not just the visitors, but the visitors who are rivals who get booed. That's a massive change in culture. And so Christian leader was now put in the place of not only being able to understand how to build an internal team, but he had to know how to read what was going on around him or her. And so I said, there needs to be a cultural engagement component around the Christian leadership component to really holistically prepare the leader. And President agreed, said, great idea, you thought of it, you get to do it. And so we launched the initiative with the podcasts, put that on the map as a regular part of our schedule. We've been doing them for well over a decade now. And we've done over 600 episodes. The beginning goes, welcome to the table, we discuss issues of God and culture. And while I'm saying that, I'm thinking that means we discuss anything and everything because it's wide open in terms of what the topics can be. And we cover an array of topics. We work from the arts, we do faith and work, we do theological issues, we do apologetics. It literally runs the gamut of stuff in terms of what could be. So in the last 2 weeks, we've discussed the value of fashion and thinking about beauty in the world. And then this week we did arts. Okay, the week before that we did in vitro fertilization. So it literally runs all over the map in terms of what we cover.
Wow. Yeah, it's been very interesting to listen to a number of those podcasts. And I think it's been very helpful. I'm glad that shift took place. And the leadership is, as you mentioned, it also was very interesting. So coming now to cultural engagement, let's talk about that. So sometimes there's, people have concerns about, especially evangelical Christians who love the gospel, want to see people come to know Christ through the gospel. Cultural engagement seems, sort of off center or something like that. And then you talk about improving society and changing culture. Can you just walk us through some of those, how you think about maybe a framework for cultural engagement, preaching the gospel, improving culture, and so on?
I see cultural engagement as an extension of the need to be able to witness to people who aren't in the church why the church has value. So I'm not in the business of trying to change the culture, although if people come to the Lord and their hearts are changed, that will change the culture, or at least have some impact on it. I'm more interested in people being connected to the living God. So the question is, how do I get people who aren't interested in the church, who are outside the church, to actually think seriously about what the church has to offer? The only way I can do that is to engage them relationally. I say cultural engagement is really about relational engagement. And so you're relating to them. You're showing your concern as a Christian about the issues in their life that matter, because God is actually a God of every space. And so cultural engagement to me is not separate from the gospel. It's not apart from the gospel. It's actually part of the gospel witness. And when the church separated itself, and I can explain historically why I think that happened, it's part of the fundamentalist modernist controversy. We're still living in the shadow of that. When we separated those two things from one another, we actually broke apart something that God had designed to work together. Because the ultimate goal of what God is doing with us is to bring people together and move them to shalom, to have them be reconciled to one another. That's supposed to happen in all public space. And so anything that we can do to model what God's heart desire is for people and the way they live their lives has value and can testify to the gospel, because we're trying to tell people God cares about people. He died for them. He died for them even though they were sinners. And so if I treat the sinner as if they're an outsider, I say people who rebel against God and don't know God are not the enemy. They're actually the goal. The Great Commission says go into the world and make disciples. It doesn't say go into the church and make disciples. So So you want to go out into the culture. And then the other thing I say about cultural engagement that's important is it's not singular. There's not one culture out there. There are cultures, and they rub against each other. I compare it to plate tectonics in geology. They rub against each other, they build pressure, and then if enough pressure, you get an earthquake. And we see earthquakes regularly in the world, not just geological earthquakes. We see earthquakes between peoples all over the world. It results in wars and things like that. It's a product of tribalism and things like that, where sin separates us from one another, etc. The gospel is ultimately about reconciliation. It's about shalom. It's anti-tribal. It says we're all connected to one God. We're all designed to be connected to one God. We have our own identity in who we are that we should be comfortable with because that's the way God made us. But ultimately, we're designed to be connected to one another and to collaborate together so that the creation hums. I like to joke that we're all supposed to be hummers. We're supposed to make the creation functional, make it work smoothly. Of course, you watch the news and you go, well, that's not quite working. So, and that's sin at work in the world. And so the gospel is designed to reverse that. And when I can show that, whether it be in the church community especially, or I work in the larger space of the world to show how things could be different, all of that is part of the witness of the church.
So cultural engagement is basically understanding cultures, and so that we can share the gospel more faithfully, live more practically, and live out our faith.
Yeah, and I tell people that when you go to share, what most Christians do is they go with the agenda of I want to share Jesus, and I say don't move too fast. Your first assignment is to get a spiritual GPS reading on the person you're having the conversation with. What makes them tick? You're not interested in whether they're right or wrong. You're interested in where they're coming from. I tell people there's a difference between trying to understand someone and understand a conversation and then the assessment that you give to it. And when you leap to assessment without working to understand where you really are in relationship to each other, you're going to botch the assessment, at least in some way. Certainly you're likely to botch it relationally, at least. And so you work to ask questions. You don't work to get into a debate. And you work to look for where the linkages are and the bridges are for people to help them come and understand what it is that the gospel is about. And then I like to make the point that when you're talking to someone who doesn't have a theological bone in their body, you're speaking a foreign language to them when you share the gospel. So you have to create categories they currently don't have. How do you do that? You do that relationally. You build enough trust to where they think about things and you can offer things to them even as a challenge that they'll take seriously because you've built a relationship with them. And I like to say there are 4 things that have to be aligned. They don't have anything to do with why we normally share the gospel. They have to be aligned in order for the gospel to make sense. That is there one God? Does that God speak? Okay, because if they don't have those 2 things in place and you say the Bible says, they'll go, well, I know it. That means nothing to me. I don't even know if God exists. I don't know that he speaks in a particular book. So why should I pay attention to that? Then you say Jesus is the only human being who's ever been the incarnate God, the creator God incarnate. Okay, that's a huge theological step. Then your last step is you're accountable to God whether you recognize it or not. All 4 of those things have to be in place for the gospel to make sense. Okay, and most people who don't have a theological bone in their body are wrestling with at least 2, if not all of those questions. So you've got to be able to get there somehow. And so by building that relationship, by asking questions, by seeing where they are in relationship to that, by looking for are there values that they have that connect to the gospel and that the gospel can speak into as a way of building bridges, you can work to create those categories as you're interacting with people.
Yeah, I think that's a very helpful kind of the framework, especially the 4 questions that you mentioned, because I think we just have a tendency to kind of launch into our gospel.
We don't even think about where the other person's coming from.
Yeah, and especially in our context here, the categories are completely different.
Exactly.
So, yeah. Can you tell us what cultural engagement in Acts, just really briefly, where do we see that? How do we see that in the book of Acts?
I've tried to say to the class that there is a passage in Acts 4 that's underappreciated that actually tells you a lot about the book. It's the prayer that the church prays after the first persecution of Peter and John. They pray for two things: to be courageous and bold about sharing Jesus. And by that, I mean not just words, but the way they actually engage people around them. And then secondly, that God would continue to perform signs and wonders and show himself in their midst to the very people who are pushing against them. That's the key. And I say, and don't let the fact that it's miracles get in the way of seeing what's going on here, because it's actually a way of serving people who are pushing back against them. The result of the miracles show that God cares for people and that God's willing to reverse their circumstances if they'll connect with him. And so if we miss that, we'll make miracles the topic, but miracles are just the means to the goal, which is to show the service and care of God, to be a part of the witness. So those two things, and I say they don't pray two other things that are important. They don't pray that the persecution stops, and they don't pray to nuke the enemy. They don't pray to wipe them off the face of the earth. No, we want to continue to serve them. We want to continue to reach out to them. We want to reach out to them not just with word, but with our deeds. And we want you, God, to work in the midst to show that you care for the people who are pushing back against us. That is such a different way of thinking about engagement than the straight confrontation model that often feeds the culture wars and the way we go about it. Now, that doesn't mean that the gospel doesn't have a challenge in it. It does. You've got to talk about sin. You've got to talk about repentance. But you never just talk about sin. You never just talk about repentance. You never just talk about the cross. I tell people that the gospel is made up of two parts, the challenge and then the invitation into new life. If you never get to the invitation into new life and you only talk about the cross, you actually haven't shared the gospel. You shared what sets up the gospel. So I joke with people, if I'm only dead to sin and I only talk about the cross, it's like getting baptized in immersion and never coming up. Okay? What happens if you stay in the water long enough? You're not a fish, you're going to die.
Right.
Okay? So Romans 6 says, I'm dead to sin, but the other half says, I'm raised to new life. That new life is actually the gospel. It allows the Spirit to come into our lives, to allow us to live in a way we were incapable of living before we had the Spirit of God, to be able to walk with God, to fellowship with God, to reflect his character. We are created in God's image to image God, and the Spirit of God makes that possible in the new life. So if we don't emphasize that other side of the equation when we're sharing the gospel and don't get to the positive part of the gospel, we haven't shared the gospel. So I tell people, we can tell the world they're depraved, they're sinful, they're dysfunctional, they're broken, however you want to describe it. But if you don't turn around and say, but you're still precious enough to God that God sent his son to die for you in order to bring you to new life, you haven't completed the loop.
Yeah. Good, very helpful. And thank you for sharing that. I want to go back for a second. In fact, our time is almost running out, unfortunately, but I do want to come back to something you mentioned about signs and wonders, especially in that prayer in Acts chapter 4. I thought that was a very helpful insight about signs and wonders showing care and not just as a power encounter or something like that. Can you just talk a little bit about signs and wonders in today's world, and does that still happen? And how should we think about signs and wonders? Obviously, a big piece of the story of Acts and so on. How does that relate to, especially in our context here in India?
The way I tend to say this, and I've tried to actually talk the class into talking about this less, because I actually think the way we have talked about the Spirit, signs and wonders, spiritual gifts, et cetera, gets in the way of some of the things that I'm talking about, because it becomes a debate. Who's right? Is the Spirit still around doing these things or not? That kind of thing. Because you have people who are cessationists all the way to people who say, no, he's doing all those things. And I say, look, God is sovereign. He can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, however he wants to do it. That part I think we should all be able to agree on. I also tell people that my own view of a gift is the consistent ability to do something. So I'd like to joke and illustrate this way. I presume that I have the gift of teaching. Doesn't mean when I preach 52 weeks out of the year that 30 weeks I've got the gift and 22 weeks I'm on my own. Okay? Means I have a consistent ability to do something. So I distinguish between God's choosing to act sovereignly in a variety of situations, a variety of ways to reach people, which he can do in whatever way he wants, and then the debate that surrounds the gifts. And I say a lot of what I see where there's a claim of gift, I don't see as matching the definition of what a gift ought to be. So I have questions about that. But I'm not going to shut off the idea that God can work, that God acts, that sometimes he works today. But I also want people to think through what the miracles actually are designed to achieve. And that's why I talk about service. Because in the end, what the miracle is designed to do, yes, it draws attention, it's a vivid way to do it. But in the end, what it's showing is the care of God. Lame people can walk, blind people can see, the dead are raised. And so as a result, and what you're showing is God cares for people in their maladies, in their deficiencies, and is trying to right those wrongs. That's the important thing that the church should be saying. We can all say that, regardless of what we think about spiritual gifts.
Right. Okay. No, that's very helpful. Thank you. So one last question as we wrap up here for today. So we've got listeners listening to this, mostly from India and probably mostly Delhi School of Theology students. I'd love to hear just you, and this is not your first time in India. You've been to India several times. You've been around the world. What would be your message to the students that are that you've met this week and around India and whatever knowledge you have of India? And maybe as part of that question would also be, what contribution do you think the church in India could make to the global mission of Christ in his kingdom?
India is destined to be a very important country in the world because it's going to be the most populous country in the world. It already is that.
Yes.
So that's important. So the Christian witness in India is important. I love the hunger of the students here. We're having a great time in class. When I open it up for question time, it just keep coming. They're that curious. They're that hungry. That's wonderful. Keep that spirit. The thing that I think I would say is that the Indian church needs to figure out how to work together. They need to wrestle with, we have our in-house differences that are kind of family conversations between brothers and sisters and cousins.
Right.
Okay. But in the midst of the need, the massive need in the world, we got to figure out how to work together. Because if we just work together in our little pockets with the things that we are in agreement about and separate from one another, we are less potent than we could be if we were to say, you know what, we really are about Jesus Christ. And we want the world to know why he makes the difference. And we'll have these little conversations amongst ourselves and have a little fun in the meantime. But we really know that the need is immense, and we need to work together to get it to happen.
Yeah, thank you. Great. Well, this has been very, very interesting and helpful. I know we could talk for hours, I'm sure. There's so much to talk about, but we really, really appreciate you being here on the podcast. And we appreciate your service to the global church, and for many, many decades, how you've been engaging, teaching, and leading. We really, really appreciate it.
Well,
Thank you for
God
being
is
here.
a good God. He's a gracious God, and he equips the church to do the job that he's called it to do.
Thank you.